in the Kurdish southeast, even recognition that Kurdish as a language can bring people plenty of trouble. In fact, while I was there, a journalist was brought to trial for having played some Kurdish music over the radio, which is technically legal. They've changed the laws to sort of accord slightly more with European Union standards, but since it's under military rule, they do pretty much what they want. And they're very brave people. I mean, there, for example, a couple of students came up after my talk, which was before a huge mob, probably thousands of people inside and outside, plenty of cameras, about half of them police cameras, international television, and so on. Several students came up and in front of the cameras handed me a Kurdish English dictionary, the first time that's been made public, which is a very bold move on their part. One of them, I've been following it closely, one of them has indeed been picked up by the police after I left. Hasn't been charged with that. I don't know if that'll come or not. He's been charged. There's several hundred students who've been charged for submitting petitions, which are legal, but as I said, the laws don't matter much. The petitions are to be allowed to have elective courses in their own languages. I don't know how many have been interrogated, but several hundred are under intense investigations, many in jail, others suspended. That's what it's like.
Turkey's managed to kind of stay, off the radar in political discourse, yet they're one of the largest recipients of American aid, and their human rights record is really atrocious, far worse than many of the other evil countries that the Bush administration likes to point out, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fact that these atrocities were kept silent here, pretty much silent, in the 90s is quite remarkable, particularly with the kind of orgy of self-congratulation that was going on among Western intellectuals, mainly here in England, but not only there, about how they were leading the world to a new era of principles and values and right and justice, and how we could not stand seeing atrocities so close to the borders of NATO, only within the borders of NATO, where we not only could stand it, but we were providing the means to carry them on, and incidentally much worse than anything charged to Milosevic in Kosovo. As for the aid, that's interesting too. It took a lot of discipline to miss it, that is, not to report it. Turkey has been a major strategic ally of the United States throughout the Cold War, of course, because of its position bordering the Middle East and next door to the Soviet Union, had missiles, nuclear missiles, and so on. It was a big issue during the missile crisis. So it had plenty of aid. The aid was, military transfers were pretty stable from 1950 to 1983. In 1984, they went up fast. They stayed high and increased until the peak year was 1997. The single year, 1997, they got more U.S. arms than the entire period, 1950 to 1983. Obviously had nothing to do with the Cold War. In fact, they were the leading recipient of U.S. military aid at that time, aside from Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. What did they need the military aid for? Well, it was jet planes, tanks, napalm, a lot of military training. That's exactly the period of the counterinsurgency operations in the southeast against 10 or 15 million Kurds, several million of whom were made refugees, thousands of villages destroyed, tens of thousands of people killed. And as I say, it peaked in 1997, just more or less coinciding with the chorus of self-praise. In 1999, Turkey was replaced in the lead by Colombia, the worst human rights violator in the Western Hemisphere. And the reason's pretty obvious. Turkey had finally succeeded in crushing domestic resistance, and Colombia hadn't. As I say, it takes a lot of discipline to not to notice any of these things. And in fact, the Turkish atrocities, which should be called U.S. atrocities, we're primarily responsible for it, were barely reported here. Still have not been.
Now, at the same time that these remain, off the screen, the government is this Office of Strategic Influence and other institutions like this are building up what seems to be a frenzy for more intervention in places like Iraq or the Philippines and Colombia. Where's that going to go?
Well, Colombia, it's been going for a long time. In fact, it goes back to the 1940s. The U.S. got into it heavily. It's a pretty violent place. It's a potentially rich country. Should be a rich country. Has plenty of resources and so on, but has a very narrow concentration of wealth, enormous poverty and repression, which has led to plenty of violence. Probably a couple 100,000 people were killed in the 50s. The United States got involved heavily under Kennedy as part of the general Kennedy involvement throughout Latin America in counterinsurgency operations, part of an aggressive stance throughout the world, in fact. The Kennedy administration sent a special forces mission down to Colombia in 1962 to advise the Colombian army. And they actually advised them to resort to what they called paramilitary terror, use of paramilitaries to carry out terror against what were called known communist proponents. Well, what that refers to, as everyone in Latin America knows, is labor leaders, peasant organizers, priests organizing peasants, human rights activists, and so on. And that was a turn from violence to the standard style of terror that we know pretty well in many places. That continued right through the 80s. It got worse in the 90s. Throughout the 1990s, Colombia had the worst human rights record in the hemisphere and was the leading recipient of U.S. arms and military training. In fact, more than the rest of the hemisphere put together. That's now picking up again in the last few years. It's now under the cover of a drug war, which nobody takes very seriously. And there is an effort to fumigate, and destroy drugs, which is a big question in itself. But it's associated with counterinsurgency operations. The Philippines, frankly, in my view, the Philippines are mainly a domestic show for home. I mean, there are the Al-Sayaf group, which is the target, is a group of criminals. Nobody doubts that, but also nobody thinks that they have any associations to speak of outside of the couple of offshore islands where they're working. But it's a show for home. Looks like a kind of a cheap place to pretend that you're fighting terrorism. There may be literally several dozen of them with no contacts. I mean, maybe they have a speedboat. As far as Iraq is concerned, that's a serious matter. We should be careful to pay close attention to it. I mean, there's no doubt in the world that Saddam Hussein is a hideous monster. And in fact, he's guilty of all the crimes of which he's accused. The worst of them being the ones that are brought up constantly, the gassing of the Kurds, the use of chemical weapons against his own population, and the Anfal operations, which killed surely tens of thousands of people. The only thing that's missing from those condemnations is that he did it with our support. The United States and Britain supported him all the way through. It continued to support him afterwards without missing a beat. A couple of years afterwards, the U.S. President Bush, number one, sent in early 1990, this 2 years after the atrocities, sent a delegation of high-level senators headed by Robert Bob Dole to Iraq to convey his good wishes to the guy who shortly after became the butcher of Baghdad when he disobeyed orders. The U.S. and Britain were also sending him not only agricultural aid, which he badly needed after having destroyed agricultural areas during the atrocities, but also a technology that could be adapted, as they knew, for weapons of mass destruction. And at that time, he really was a threat. I mean, now he's bad enough, but much less of a threat after the destruction of the last 10 years. So the charges are correct, but there's a few missing words. As to the U.S. interest in taking over Iraq, I mean, the reasons for that are entirely obvious and have been for a long time. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia. One way or another, the U.S., we can be confident, is going to make sure it gains control over them and deny them to its adversaries. At the moment, France and Russia and others have the inside track, and the U.S. is unlikely to tolerate that. And they may consider this an opportunity to rearrange things so they control the oil. Incidentally, Turkey is very concerned about this because one of the likely scenarios is that, and it's discussed pretty openly there, and somewhat here, is that the United States may try to use Turkey, which is on the border, as a military force, as kind of like a mercenary army. They have a big army, well armed thanks to us, to use them as a force to take over the northern area. That's the northern area, especially Mosul and Kirkuk, has a huge amount of oil, much of it undeveloped. Turkey's had its eye on it all through its history, actually with some justice. The border between, a lot of the population is Turkish, and the border between Turkey and Iraq is like all the borders, an artificial border that was established by the British back 80 years ago to ensure that the British had control over the oil, not the Turks. And the Turks might be willing to do that if they get a quid pro quo, the control over the oil. The big problem for them is the Kurdish problem. They have, well, I mentioned they're treating their own Kurdish population, and of course the northern part of Iraq has plenty of Kurds. So there's serious problems about how that might work. But that's a scenario that they're concerned about and various opinions about. But one way or another, it's not unlikely that the U.S. will do something to try to ensure its control over Iraqi oil, which is a very hazardous affair. But I wouldn't be surprised if they went ahead in some manner.
Noam, this is Hep. Just recently, the Bush administration announced $98 million to Colombia, not for anti-terrorism, but to protect Occidental's pipeline. Do you think Al Gore will be asking the government to send a bill to Occidental for that protection? Is this amazing degree of vulgar acceptance of the corporations? I mean, what does that portend for the country in terms of the connection between corporate power and the government?
To tell you the honest truth, I think there is virtually no detectable difference between the political parties on this. I mean, Bush probably is more in the pocket of the oil companies than Gore was, but I think it's marginal. I mean, Clinton was doing the same thing. Part of the reason for the U.S. involvement right through the 90s was to protect oil investment and other extraction operations.
You, and as well as Ed, have studied propaganda, manufacturing consent. How would you judge these current efforts, especially since September 11th? We continue to see these polls, at least, which suggest this amazingly overwhelming support and very little discussion, very little dissent in the mainstream press. I mean, is this pretty much par for the course? Is this what you'd expect, or is it even worse than usual?
Actually, to tell you the honest truth, I think it's better than usual. If you go back to other, I don't know, take, say, the Vietnam War. I mean, the United States attacked South Vietnam in 1961. I don't have to tell you, you know more about it than I do. That's when Kennedy sent the Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam over the objections of the top military, as you showed. The U.S. authorized napalm. It was destroying food supplies. It started herding, ultimately, millions of people into concentration camps. Was there any protest? There wasn't even any discussion. I mean, it was 5 or 6 years later before you could even get a couple of people together to talk about it. The war went on for years with no protest. And the fact of the matter is that in the media and among intellectuals, there almost never was any protest. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the protest against the Vietnam War, but if you look at the educated sectors, or the media, they very rarely went beyond the standpoint of the business community. I mean, the business world ultimately turned against the war, especially after the Tet Offensive in 1968, on the grounds that it was just getting too costly to the United States. It was causing stagflation at home and harming the American economy, and besides, the U.S. had essentially won all its objectives anyway, so they wanted it over. Well, around that point, the media started mild criticism, mainly because it was too costly. I mean, at the very far edge, you got Anthony Lewis, who's probably the most extreme critic in the media, saying that the war began with blundering efforts to do good. That's when we started wiping the place out. But by 1969, it was clear that it was becoming too costly to the United States. I mean, that's criticism. You had German generals criticizing the Nazis in those terms after Stalingrad, and that was the limit. It's not true among the general public. So regular polls have been taken for 35 years, and they show a fairly steady, 2/3 to 70%, roughly in that neighborhood, people saying that the Vietnam War was, well, the wording of the polls is fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. You can hardly find a phrase to that effect in print, aside from the extreme margins. That's why McNamara's book was received the way it was. It was criticized by the Hawks, but it was welcomed by the Doves, who argued that it was a vindication of their position. Their only criticism of it was that he was too late. Well, what did he say? I mean, there was no apology to the Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. He apologized to Americans for having not told them soon enough that they didn't think the war was winnable. That's the big apology, and that's supposed to be the position of the Doves. Well, if you compare that with now, it's very different. There's much more dissent, much more controversy. The population has opened up since September. There's meetings, discussions all over the place. I mean, the people who are available to give talks and travel, I'm one of them, are just overwhelmed with requests. I spend at least an hour every night just saying, I'm sorry, I can't come to so-and-so. Same experience with others. Book sales are going up. As far as the media and the intellectual classes are concerned, they're doing about what they always do. They're subordinate to state power. Maybe less so now than usual, in fact.
Well, Noam, I don't want to steal too much of your time. I know you're incredibly busy, so I'm going to end it there. And thank you so much, and we're very fortunate that we're going to have you here in town in October. We're looking forward to that.
Yeah. Okay.
And we're going to go out and buy you a Stetson and cowboy boots, and we'll be all set. So I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, and we're looking forward to seeing you, and you always have a place on KPFT.
Okay, good talk to you.
Thanks, Noam.
Yep.
Good night, Noam.
Bye.
A Bird's Eye View, a woman's perspective with Lillian Kerr. Here's another short biography of a wonderful woman. Tilly Olson. Tilly Olson didn't have much to write about until she was almost 50 years old. The daughter of Russian immigrants, she dropped out of high school after the 11th grade to go to work full-time. Her parents were active socialists in Nebraska, and although her growing up years were marked by poverty, Tilly says it was a rich childhood from the standpoint of ideas. Tilly wrote skits and musicals for the Young Socialist League when she was a teenager. In 1931, she joined the Young Communist League and went to Kansas City to attend a Communist Party school. While in Kansas City, Tilly was arrested for distributing leaflets to packing house workers. She became extremely ill with pleurisy in jail, and when she was released, Tilly moved to Minnesota early in 1932 to recuperate. Bedridden by the incipient tuberculosis that had developed from the pleurisy, for the first time in her life, Tilly had to write and quickly completed the first 3 chapters of her novel, Yo Non Dio. As she began to recover, however, Tilly became involved in a relationship that resulted in pregnancy, and she had her first child when she was 19 years old. Tilly had submitted an excerpt from her novel to the Partisan Review that was accepted and published under the title The Iron Throat in 1934. Critic Robert Cantwell chose Tilly's story as the best of 200 stories in 50 literary magazines, calling it a work of early genius. As a result of this discovery, 2 publishing houses were looking for her, but Tilly's political activities had once again landed her in jail. She later signed a contract with Random House, promising to deliver one chapter of her book each month in exchange for a stipend. Tilly sent her daughter to live with her parents and moved to Los Angeles to write. But she couldn't do it and forfeited the contract. In 1936, Tilly and her daughter moved in with fellow socialist Jack Olson, and Tilly bore 3 more daughters. The couple married in 1944, just before Jack entered the military. The years between 1936 and 1959 were extremely difficult ones for Tilly, as she worked at a variety of jobs: waitress, shaker in a laundry, transcriber in a dairy equipment company, capper of mayonnaise jars, secretary, and Kelly girl, raised her daughters, and tried to write. Tilly also remained politically active in the 1940s and 1950s. In 1955, she won a Stanford University fellowship that gave her the first chance in 20 years to do any sustained writing. For 8 months, Tilly did not have to hold a wage-earning job. I had continuity 3 full days a week, sometimes more, and it was in those months I made the mysterious turn and became a writing writer. When the money ran out, she had to return to 9-hour workdays, but in 1959, a Ford Foundation grant allowed her to finish and publish Tell Me a Riddle, which won the prestigious O. Henry Award for Best Short Story of the Year in 1961. Tell Me a Riddle became the title story of short story collection Tilly finally saw published when she was 50 years old. In 1974, after setting aside Io Non Dio for 40 years, she finally revised and published it. Tilly celebrated her 89th birthday on January 14th. I'm Lillian Kerr with a Bird's Eye View.
With us tonight is Sanho Tree. Sanho, welcome to the Progressive Forum. Could you start off by giving us a little background on this conflict that's going on in Colombia?
Well, this current conflict is a 38-year-old civil war, which kind of grew out of the previous civil war. And, Colombia has not experienced an entire generation of peace since independence from Spain. So these conflicts have been going on for quite some time in Colombia. And this current one, the rebel movement, the FARC, the Spanish initials FARC, came out of the previous civil war, and they've been battling government forces since Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States. So this is a very long conflict. There are numerous actors involved. In addition to the guerrillas, there's the Colombian military, which the United States is supporting to the tune of over $1 billion of military aid. And then there's another small rebel group called the ELN. And then there are the right-wing paramilitary death squads, known by their Spanish initials, AUC, the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. Now, the AUC is responsible for about 3/4 of the massacres that happen in Colombia. And the massacres defined as 4 or more people being killed at one time. So it's an incredibly violent and brutal civil war. And the paramilitaries are very closely allied with the Colombian military, which U.S. taxpayers are supporting.
Okay, and briefly, playing Colombia, this was something that our previous president, Bill Clinton, helped to push through Congress in order to give aid to Colombia to fight the drug war. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, back in the year 2000, the Clinton administration proposed, and Congress came up with $1.3 billion to fight the so-called drug war. Now, 80% of that money was militarized aid, which went mostly to the Colombian military and the national police. And very little of it went to address the root causes of both the civil war and the illicit drug economy. So this has been increasing every year now. Last year was the Andean Regional Initiative, which got more money to fight the drug war and its spillover effects in the neighboring countries, because the neighboring countries were quite outraged at our policy, which basically pushed the war and drug cultivation into their borders. And this year, the administration is asking for additional money, including $98 million to protect an oil pipeline owned by Occidental Petroleum, which would, for the first time, put this country in the position of getting involved in counter-insurgency. Now, this is the really scary part of it, because throughout the original debate, members of Congress, the Clinton administration, all these officials promised us up and down, don't worry, we're not getting sucked into this ancient civil war. This is just about counter-narcotics. And so now, for the first time, the Bush administration is saying, well, let's get involved in the civil war. Let's fight the guerrillas directly, because they're bombing this pipeline. It's nearly 500 miles long, operated by Occidental Petroleum, which, by the way, lobbied very hard for military aid to Colombia. So with the stink of the Enron scandal still in the air, it really stunned me to hear that the Bush administration would ask for this private protection money for one corporation, one oil company, that spent a lot of money lobbying Congress. Certainly this $98 million is going to benefit Occidental very, very much. Occidental had been paying protection money to the various guerrilla groups to let their pipeline operate. They opened this pipeline back in 1986 and had been paying protection money for quite some time, and relations have soured, and the guerrillas have bombed it about a little under 1,000 times. So this is a pipeline that's extremely vulnerable. I don't think this $98 million, which is supposed to fund a infrastructure protection brigade, special unit of the Colombian military just to protect special infrastructure targets like the pipeline, it can't do that. It's just too vulnerable. And so when this thing keeps getting blown up in the coming year, we're going to be faced with a problem of, well, do we admit this is a failure, or do we escalate? Moreover, the United States trainers and advisors, and also our private military contractors, generally don't travel by land, by SUV. It's very unsafe to be on those roads because you could get stopped at a roadblock and abducted and kidnapped by the rebels or by the paramilitaries or whoever. And so they fly around in helicopters, and the guerrillas have been shooting at these helicopters for quite some time. They've brought a few down, including Blackhawks. Thus far, Americans have not been killed or captured directly by the guerrillas. But it's just a matter of time before one of those helicopters comes down with Americans on board. And then Congress has to decide, well, what do we do now? Do we turn the other cheek, pretend it didn't happen? Do we tuck our tail between our legs and retreat? Or do we retaliate and escalate?
Do you see any similarities between Colombia and Vietnam?
When people try to make Vietnam analogies, you tend to be pushing the paradigm. I think Colombia is tailor-made. It resonates so much with the Vietnam parallel because, once again, this is a war that we don't have a clear exit strategy. We don't have a clear end game. How do we know victory? Will we know victory when we see it? What is success? Is it when we wiped out 20% of the coca crop, or 50%, or 100%? Is the war won when U.S. citizens stop using drugs altogether? Or are we there to push the guerrillas south of the equator? Are we there to degrade their military capability, as in Kosovo? Is there an enemy capital to capture? Is there a flag to take down? No one's willing to say what victory looks like. And if we don't know what victory looks like, the next question is, do we know what defeat looks like? Because I would argue that we've been staring at it for many years now, that after record amounts of counter-narcotics assistance, more drugs than ever are coming into the United States from Colombia. And that has a lot to do with the dynamics and economics of the drug war, that it's very difficult to fight this kind of prohibition economy, because all it does is constrict supplies and increase profits for those who remain in that economy, and it draws more people into it. Prohibition doesn't mean you control drugs. It means you give up the right to control drugs. And the only people who regulate that industry are basically organized crime. And the way they regulate it is through guns. They can't go to courts and say, Your Honor, I've been dealing drugs in this corner for 15 years, and this upstart came and, it doesn't work that way. They settle it through gunfire.